There is a dark, unwritten rule in the Appalachian Mountains that every single local knows by heart, a rule passed down through generations, born from pure terror, shattered minds, and blood-soaked survival. If you are walking deep in those ancient woods and you hear your name called from the pitch-black shadows, no, you didn't. If you see a tall, pale, impossibly thin shape staring at you from the heavy brush, no, you didn't. And above all else, if you value your life, your soul, and your sanity, never, ever whistle after the sun goes down. My name is the narrator. And tonight I am going to share 3 true, deeply chilling accounts of people who dared to break those ancient rules. People who thought the mountain lore was just a silly joke told around campfires until the mountains came to collect them. You think you know the woods, you think that because you've hiked them, mapped them, or camped in them, you own them. You don't. In the Appalachian Mountains, there is an unwritten law, a code as ancient as the rocks themselves, and if you break it, well, you don't disappear, you just stop being you. I've spent 3 years collecting these accounts, not from books, not from internet forums, but from the people who live in the hollows, the ones who know better than to whistle after midnight, the ones who understand that the dark has eyes. Tonight I'm giving you the rules, and these aren't suggestions, these are your only chance to walk back out of those woods alive. The first account comes from an experienced hiker named Elias. Elias was a seasoned, cynical outdoorsman who spent years navigating the toughest backcountry terrains in North America. He used to laugh out loud at the local legends, calling them superstitious bedtime stories invented to scare away naive tourists. He had survived bear encounters, brutal winters, and treacherous cliffs, so he believed he was entirely invincible. It was a freezing, overcast night in mid-October when Elias was trekking deep near the Great Smoky Mountains. The fog was heavy, rolling off the ridges and swallowing the trees whole as the last remnants of daylight vanished. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the air became thick with the smell of damp pine, wet earth, and old decay. As midnight approached, exhausted and shivering, he decided to pitch his tent in a remote clearing deep within the backcountry. In his haste and extreme exhaustion, he didn't realize he had set up camp right next to a century-old, abandoned mining shaft. The mouth of the shaft was a black void in the earth, surrounded by rusted iron, equipment, jagged rocks, and rotting timber beams. Rule number 1 of these woods is clear. Never answer to your name if you hear it from behind you, especially if you're alone. It's not your friend, it's not your partner, it's a mimic trying to pull you into the dark. At exactly 12 o'clock, the entire forest fell completely, unnaturally, and violently silent. Not a single cricket chirped in the brush, not a single owl called from the high canopy, not a single leaf rustled, even though a freezing mountain breeze had been blowing just seconds before. The complete absence of sound was heavy, suffocating the dark air and pressing down on Elias's chest like a physical weight. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, a silence that signals something apex is hunting in the dark. Then, out of the pitch-black mouth of the abandoned mining shaft, he heard it, a low, sharp, rhythmic whistle cutting through the dead, stagnant silence. It carried the distinct, chilling melody of an old childhood lullaby. But everything about the pitch and cadence felt entirely wrong. It sounded human, yet completely devoid of human warmth or breath, echoing perfectly off the rusted metal of the mine. It rose and fell with a terrifying precision, as if whatever was making the sound was mocking the concept of music. Elias made the ultimate, fatal mistake of his life. To prove his bravery to the darkness, and to convince himself he wasn't afraid, he puckered his lips and whistled back. He echoed the exact same playful tune right into the open, dark void of the mine shaft, his voice cutting through the mist. The very millisecond his voice faded into the trees, the whistling inside the shaft stopped instantly. The suffocating silence returned, but this time Elias knew it wasn't just quiet, it was a trap. A second later, a horrific, wet, sliding sound began to echo from the deep depths of the dirt. Something heavy, slick, and completely unnatural was crawling up out of the dark opening. Elias shone his flashlight toward the shaft, his hands shaking so violently the beam danced wildly across the rocks. The light illuminated a creature that did not possess a human face. It was just a blank canvas of pale, leathery skin. It had a sickeningly white, elongated neck that twisted, snapped, and slid forward along the dirt like a giant blind snake. The skin was translucent, showing dark black veins pulsing beneath the surface as it stretched out toward his camp. Elias didn't wait to see the rest of its monstrous body emerge into the pale moonlight. He abandoned his expensive gear, left his tent standing wide open, and sprinted blindly into the total darkness. He ran for 3 agonizing miles, tearing his clothes on briars and tripping over jagged rocks in the pitch black. He could hear the wet, heavy thudding of something moving through the trees right behind him, keeping pace with his panic. He made it out of the woods alive, reaching a ranger station at dawn, but his spirit was permanently broken. To this very day, Elias cannot sleep without loud white noise, because the moment the room gets quiet, he hears that exact same rhythmic whistle echoing from the corners of his room. The second story involves a small group of college students hiking through the wilderness of West Virginia. They were 4 close friends looking for an autumn adventure, intentionally venturing far away from the marked tourist trails. They wanted a true wilderness experience, ignoring the warning signs posted at the edge of the state park regarding lost hikers. Rule number 2 of the mountains is absolute. If you see a light in the woods, that shouldn't be there. Do not approach it. That is not a lost hiker looking for help. That is the lure, designed to pull you off the path and into the fog. The autumn leaves were beautiful, but as they went deeper, the canopy closed in, blocking out the sun and creating an eternal twilight. A few hours into the dense, overgrown wilderness, they spotted something odd sitting directly in the middle of the narrow path. It was an old, heavy leather hiking boot. What made it strange was that despite the miles of muddy, rain-soaked terrain around it, the boot was immaculately, perfectly clean. There was no dirt on the leather, no mud on the tattered laces, and the soles looked completely unworn, as if placed there a minute ago. One of the male students laughed nervously, reaching down to pick it up out of curiosity, thinking someone had lost it. But when he tilted the boot toward the fading light, the laughter died instantly in his throat and his face turned stark white. Tucked deeply inside the boot was a freshly severed human finger, still dripping dark blood onto the clean insole. The bleeding finger was wrapped tightly in a single torn page ripped directly from an old Holy Bible. The text on the torn page was stained with red, but the visible words spoke of judgment, shadows, and valleys of death. The students froze in absolute terror, trying to convince themselves it was just a sick, elaborate prank set up by pranksters. But then one of the girls slowly looked up at the ancient, towering trees surrounding their small perimeter. Carved deeply and freshly into the rough, bleeding bark of every single tree trunk were there names, 4 names, spelled perfectly. Names they had never uttered out loud since entering the boundaries of these woods. The carvings were wet with sap, indicating they had been made within the last few minutes while they were walking. Before their panicked minds could even process the horror, a low, collective whispering began to rise from the earth. It wasn't coming from the canopy, and it wasn't the wind blowing through the autumn leaves. It was a chorus of dry, raspy voices coming from the damp ground directly beneath their muddy boots. The voices were repeating their names over and over, growing louder, turning into a frantic, chaotic chant. Suddenly, the forest floor tore open like wet paper. Ice-cold, skeletal human hands reached out from the black dirt, grabbing tightly onto their ankles with a vice-like grip. The grip was monstrously strong, digging jagged fingernails deep through their socks into their skin and pulling them downward into the soil. The ground began to swallow their feet, pulling them into the freezing, wet mud of the mountain. Terrified, they screamed at the top of their lungs, kicking frantically and violently, dragging each other away from the grasping hands. One of them used a trekking pole to smash the skeletal fingers, hearing them snap like dry twigs. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, they managed to break free and ran without looking back until their lungs burned. They didn't stop until they hit the bright, concrete safety of the main state highway miles away. They escaped the physical forest that evening, but the mountain left a permanent, unforgettable mark on their flesh. Today, all 4 of those friends shared the exact same jagged, deep, unhealable scar wrapped around their left ankle, a physical reminder that the dirt remembers their names. The final account is the most deeply disturbing of all because it happened to a professional park ranger. This was a man of the law, a man of science, who knew every hidden trail, every cave, and every real danger of the mountain. He had spent 15 years scoffing at cryptid stories, fully believing that every strange occurrence in the woods had a rational explanation. He knew how animals behaved, how weather patterns worked, and how easily human senses could be deceived by shadows. I spoke to this man, let's call him Thomas, who witnessed the true breakdown of reality in the deep woods. He described something tall, something that absolutely did not move like a normal person. It was waiting out near the roaring waterfall, its shadow stretching out wildly, not away from the light but directly towards him. He had been dispatched to investigate a series of frantic, breathless reports about a shadow man lurking near that popular waterfall. Multiple tourists had called the station, screaming about a tall, dark mass that was stalking people from the edge of the tree line. When Thomas arrived at the coordinates, the sun had already dipped below the ridge, leaving the forest in a deep purple twilight. The rain was pouring down, creating a heavy roar that drowned out all distant sounds. As he pushed through a thick grove of spruce trees, he stumbled upon a hidden campsite tucked away near the rushing water. A large campfire was still crackling loudly, defying the rain, sending a thin, steady trail of white smoke up into the dark canopy. But there was absolutely no one there. The tents were unzipped, sleeping bags laid out, but completely abandoned. On the wooden camp table sat a single ceramic plate of fresh food, still steaming heavily in the cold mountain air. Right next to the plate, weighted down by a jagged stone, was a piece of crumpled paper with a frantic handwritten note. The handwriting started neat but degenerated into a wild, shaky scrawl at the bottom of the page. The note read, "It called us by our names. It invited us into the water. We couldn't say no." Thomas felt a wave of icy cold sweat break out across his neck as he slowly turned his head toward the roaring waterfall. He raised his high-powered flashlight, cutting a bright beam through the mist and spray of the crashing water. Behind the heavy, transparent veil of the roaring waterfall, he saw 3 dark human figures standing perfectly still against the wet rock face. They weren't moving to escape the freezing torrent. They weren't gasping for breath beneath the heavy weight of the water. Their eyes were wide open, glassy, and fixed directly on the flashlight beam. They were just standing there in the dark, staring directly through the water, waiting patiently for him to come closer. Panicking, his training completely failing him, Thomas reached for his radio to call the main station for immediate backup. He switched the channel on, but no human voice came through the static, and the emergency frequency was dead. All that blasted out of the small speaker at maximum volume was the clear, horrifying sound of someone whistling. It was a perfect, crystal-clear rendition of the exact same childhood lullaby from the mining shaft, playing on a loop through the radio static. He dropped the radio, turned around, and never looked back, resigning from his position the very next morning. The Appalachian Mountains are not just beautiful collections of trees, ancient rocks, and flowing rivers. They possess an ancient, dark, sentient consciousness and a terrifyingly long, vengeful memory. They have been watching humanity walk beneath their canopy for thousands of years, learning our weaknesses and our fears. They know exactly how to mimic the things we love, and they know exactly how to trigger our deepest terrors. The mountains don't want you. They don't want your curiosity. They want your complete and total silence. If you're planning to go into the deep woods this weekend, keep this warning playing in the back of your mind. Or better yet, stay home. Once those woods hear the sound of your voice, and once they carve your name into their roots, they never ever let go. If you ever find yourself walking through the isolated trails of the Appalachians, remember this warning with every step you take. Stay on the designated gravel path, no matter what you think you see in the dark. Never look into the thick, dark brush when you feel eyes on your back, and keep your mouth completely shut the very moment the night falls, because in the deep woods, your absolute silence is the only thing keeping you alive. If you have a story that needs to be told, a dark truth you're afraid to keep inside, send it to me. And if you aren't afraid of what hides in the shadows, subscribe to the narrator's shadow. I'll be right here in the deep dark, waiting for you next week.